He seems disoriented. Possible fraud risk. Those were the exact words Tyler Brennan, the new branch manager of Hartwell Savings and Trust, used when he picked up the phone on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in November. The old man at the counter had come to withdraw $4,000 from an account he had opened 53 years ago, back when the bank still had marble floors and a clock that ticked loud enough to hear from the sidewalk. The old man did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply walked over to the waiting chairs by the window, sat down, folded his weathered hands in his lap, and waited. What Tyler Brennan did not know, what no one inside that branch knew, was that in exactly 23 minutes, a black SUV would pull into the parking lot, and the man stepping out of it would change every single thing about this afternoon. If you believe an old veteran deserves more than to be called confused in the bank he built his life around, type honor in the comments right now. The old man's name was Earl Whitaker, and at 81 years old, he had not raised his voice in anger since the summer of 1970. He lived alone in a small white house on the edge of Hartwell County, the same house he'd bought with his wife Ruth in 1974, the same house where they had raised their 2 children, the same house where Ruth had died in the back bedroom on a Thursday morning in 2016, while Earl held her hand and read quietly from the Book of Psalms. The mornings in that house were very quiet now. Earl would rise before the sun, make coffee in the same percolator Ruth had bought him for their 40th anniversary, and sit at the kitchen table watching the light change over the pecan tree in the backyard. He kept his old Marine Corps cap on a hook by the front door, but he almost never wore it anymore. He said it felt too much like announcing something, and Earl Whitaker had never once in his life believed in announcing anything. His left hand shook a little when he lifted his mug, and he had long since stopped trying to hide it. The tremor was not from age. It was from a piece of shrapnel still lodged near his spine from a morning in Anhor Valley, when he was 23 years old, and a corpsman named Alvarez had told him, very calmly, that he was not going to make it to sundown. Earl had made it. A great many men had not. He had come home in the spring of 1970 with a silver star pinned to a uniform he folded into a cedar trunk in his closet and never wore again. He did not talk about the war. He did not talk about what he had done to earn that medal. His children had asked him once when they were small, and Earl had looked at them for a long quiet moment before saying only, "I carried a friend home." That was the last time the subject came up in that house. What nobody in his family knew, not even Ruth in all 46 years they shared a bed, was that the friend he had carried home was not just any friend. It was a man whose son would, many years later, step out of a black SUV in a small-town bank parking lot, wearing a uniform he had earned the hard way, and ask very quietly to speak with his father's Marine. The Hartwell branch of Hartwell Savings and Trust sat on the corner of Main Street and Oak, in a 2-story brick building that had been there since 1921. Earl remembered the winter night in 1968, when the original bank had burned to its foundation in a grease fire from the diner next door, and he remembered how the whole town had come out the following Saturday morning to help clean up the rubble. He had shoveled bricks into a wheelbarrow alongside his father. He had been 19 years old. The bank had been rebuilt by summer. Same marble teller counter, same brass fixtures, a different clock. Earl had opened his first savings account there in March of 1972, 3 months after coming home from Vietnam, with $187 in discharge pay, and a promise to himself that he was going to build a life worth having in the country that had sent him there. Hartwell Savings and Trust had stayed a small-town bank for most of his lifetime. Then, 3 years ago, it had been acquired by a larger regional institution out of Charlotte, and the marble had been torn out and replaced with polished concrete, and the brass fixtures swapped for brushed aluminum, and the old manager, a man named Harold Benson, who had known Earl for 41 years, had been quietly let go in favour of someone younger and cheaper, and more aggressive about quarterly metrics. That someone was Tyler Brennan. Tyler was 29 years old. He had an MBA from a state school he was privately ashamed of, and a fiancée in the city who had started to wonder out loud whether he was ever going to make real money. He had been the manager of the Hartwell branch for 4 months, and his numbers were not good. The regional vice president had sent him an email the previous Friday with the subject line, "We need to talk about your fraud flags," and Tyler had not slept well since. On the morning of November 10th, he had come into the branch determined to catch something. Anything. And at 1:47 that afternoon, when a slow-moving old man in a faded corduroy jacket walked up to the teller counter and asked Margaret Porter for a $4,000 cash withdrawal, Tyler Brennan saw the answer to every problem he had. What he did not see, what he would not realize until it was far too late, was that in a security monitoring office 300 miles away in Charlotte, North Carolina, a single phrase had just flashed across a screen that very few people in the company were cleared to see. The phrase read, "Protected account, alert level 1. Margaret Porter had been a teller at Hartwell Savings and Trust for 41 years. She had started the same year Earl had opened his first account, and in a sense the two of them had grown up at that counter together. She remembered Earl's wife Ruth. She remembered both of Earl's children when they were small enough to sit on the counter while Earl made deposits. She remembered the afternoon in 1989 when Earl had come in to take out the money for his son's first year of college, and the afternoon in 2016 when Earl had come in, a month after Ruth's funeral, to close out his wife's personal checking account with his eyes red and his voice absolutely steady. When Earl stepped up to her window at 1:47 that afternoon and slid his worn leather wallet and his driver's license across the counter, Margaret smiled the way she always smiled at him, and she said, "Earl, honey, it's good to see you. What can I do for you today?" And Earl smiled back the small, tired smile of a man who had been finding reasons to smile for 60 years, and he said, "Margaret, I need to take out $4,000 in cash for Ellie's wedding. I want to pay the vendors in person the morning of, envelopes in hand. It's how Ruth would have done it." Margaret did not ask him why. She did not need to. She knew exactly why. She had watched Earl set aside money in that savings account for that girl's wedding since the week Ellie was born, small deposit after small deposit, $100 here and $50 there, for 22 years. She pulled up his account on her screen, confirmed the available balance, and began to fill out the withdrawal slip by hand, the way she always did for her longtime customers. That was when Tyler Brennan walked up behind her. He had been watching from his glass-walled office for the last 30 seconds. He had seen the old man. He had seen the withdrawal amount. He had read that morning's email about the fraud flags. He had read yesterday's compliance training module about elder financial abuse. And he made a decision in the space of about 2 seconds. "Margaret," he said, in the voice he used when he was about to override her, "hold on that. I want to review this one personally." Margaret's hand froze over the cash drawer. She turned her head slightly, just enough to look at Tyler without fully facing him, and she said, very quietly, very carefully, "Tyler, this is Earl Whitaker. He has been a customer of this bank since 1972. Tyler did not look at her. He was looking at Earl. "Sir," he said, in the practiced mid-range voice of a man who had just completed a 4-hour compliance seminar, "I'm the branch manager. I'd like to ask you a few questions before we process this withdrawal." Earl lifted his head. He looked at Tyler for a long moment with the pale blue eyes that had once watched a jungle tree line for 11 straight hours without blinking, and then he nodded and said, "Of course, son. Whatever you need." Tyler did not like being called son. He did not know why. He pressed on. "Sir, $4,000 in cash is a significant amount. Can you tell me the specific purpose of this withdrawal?" And Earl, with no trace of impatience in his voice, said, "It's for my granddaughter's wedding. I am paying the vendors." Tyler nodded the slow, performative nod he had been taught to nod when buying time. "And has anyone, Mr. He glanced down at the license. "Mr. Whitaker, has anyone recently contacted you about a financial matter? A phone call claiming to be from a grandchild in trouble, perhaps? An email requesting gift cards? A person instructing you to take out cash and meet them somewhere?" Earl's expression did not change. "No, son. My granddaughter is getting married a week from Saturday. I am paying for her wedding." The short line of customers behind Earl had gone very still. A young woman named Sarah Mitchell, 25 years old and in line to deposit a check for her waitressing tips, felt a prickle of something move up the back of her neck that she could not, in that moment, quite put a name to. Tyler glanced at his screen. He glanced at Margaret, who was staring at him now with an expression he did not know how to read. And then he made his second decision of the afternoon. He picked up the desk phone and pressed the extension for the security office, and he said the exact words that, within the next 50 minutes, would end his career in banking forever. "I have an elderly gentleman at window 2 who seems disoriented, and may be a fraud risk. Please come to the lobby and escort him to the waiting area while we conduct a welfare check." Earl did not protest when Ray Donovan, the branch's uniformed security guard, walked up behind him a moment later. He did not ask for an explanation. He did not raise his voice. He simply picked up his driver's license from the counter, slid it back into the worn leather wallet Ruth had given him for Christmas in 1991, and walked, without a word, to the cluster of padded chairs beside the front window. Ray, who was 54 years old and had done 2 tours in Iraq with the Army National Guard, could not look Earl in the eye. "I'm sorry about this, sir," he muttered under his breath. Earl sat down slowly, the shrapnel near his spine reminding him, as it always did, that he was not built for fast movement anymore. He folded his hands in his lap. He looked out the window at the parking lot, at the bare branches of the maple tree by the drive-through lane, at the American flag hanging limp on the pole in front of the municipal building across the street. He was not angry. Anger was something he had learned a long time ago how to set down and walk away from. He was thinking instead about a morning 56 years earlier when he had been pinned down behind a low earthen berm in a rice paddy outside a village called Thuong Duc, with a 24-year-old lieutenant from Wilmington, North Carolina, whose right leg was very badly broken below the knee and whose helmet had been shot clean off his head. The lieutenant's name had been James Holloway. Earl had looked at him in that moment, and James Holloway had looked back at him, and James had said through his teeth, "Whittaker, you leave me in this paddy, I swear to God I will haunt you." And Earl had laughed. He had actually laughed. Because what else could you do? He had gotten his arm under James's shoulders, and he had dragged him nearly 2 miles back to the marine line under a sky full of green tracer rounds, and he had taken 1 bullet through the meat of his left thigh, and 2 more through his back before the world finally got quiet. When he had collapsed with James still breathing behind the wire, the corpsman named Alvarez had looked at Earl's wounds and had told him very gently that he was not going to make it to sundown. Earl had made it. James Holloway had lived. They had written letters to each other for 33 years, and now, sitting in a padded chair in the lobby of a bank that had forgotten him, Earl thought about James, and about Ruth, and about the pecan tree in his backyard, and he waited. Back at the counter, Margaret Porter was doing something that, in 41 years of service at Hartwell Savings and Trust, she had never once done before. She was logging out of her terminal in the middle of her shift. She walked past Tyler without looking at him. She went into the small back room where the employee phones were kept, and she dialed the direct line of her regional supervisor, a woman named Diane Chen. Diane Chen had been Margaret's supervisor for 11 years. She had been at Ruth Whittaker's funeral, she answered on the second ring. Margaret said, "Diane, Tyler Brennan has flagged Earl Whittaker for fraud and put him in the lobby with a security guard. I need someone to call me back in the next 5 minutes, or I am walking out of this building and I am not coming back." There was a silence on the other end of the line, and then Diane Chen said, in a voice Margaret had rarely in her career heard her use, "Margaret, do not hang up. Stay on this line." What Margaret did not know, and what Tyler Brennan certainly did not know, was that 3 years earlier, when the regional institution had acquired Hartwell Savings and Trust, the new chief executive officer had personally gone through the customer roster of the small-town branch and had flagged a very short list of accounts with a designation that did not appear anywhere in the public training materials or the employee handbook. The designation was called Protected Account at Alert Level 1. There were 11 names on that list. The list had been compiled by the CEO himself one Sunday evening in his office, from a yellow legal pad his father had kept locked in a desk drawer for 19 years. Earl Whittaker's name was the third name on the list, and at 1:52 that afternoon, a small notification chimed on the CEO's personal cell phone in a conference room on the 41st floor of the Charlotte headquarters, and the CEO, who had been about to walk into a scheduled meeting with a board subcommittee, looked down at the screen and read 4 words that made him stop breathing. The words were, "Whittaker, Earl, fraud flag." He stared at the screen for 3 full seconds. Then he turned to his executive assistant, a woman named Patricia, and he said in a voice she had never heard him use before, "Cancel the afternoon. Call the driver. I need the car at the south entrance in 4 minutes." The CEO's name was Marcus Holloway. He was 53 years old. He was the son of James Holloway, who had been carried almost 2 miles out of a rice paddy in Anhoa Valley on the 22nd of March in 1969 by a 23-year-old Marine Squad leader named Earl Whittaker. James Holloway had lived to come home. He had met Marcus's mother at a church picnic in Wilmington in the spring of 1972. He had raised his son on stories he did not tell often, but that landed, when he told them, with the weight of stones dropped from a great height. The story James had told most often, the one that shaped Marcus more than any other, was the story of the Marine who had not left him in the paddy. James had always said when he told that story that a man who carries you home when he has 3 holes in him is not a man you ever finish being grateful to. Marcus had grown up with a photograph on the mantelpiece of a very young Marine with a sunburned face and pale blue eyes standing next to his father at a Camp Lejeune retirement ceremony in 1982. The Marine was Earl Whittaker. Marcus had met Earl exactly twice in his life. Once at that retirement, when Marcus was 9 years old and had shaken Earl Whittaker's hand and had not understood why his father had cried afterward in the parking lot. And once at his father's funeral in 2003, when Earl had driven 11 hours from Hartwell to Wilmington to be there and had sat in the back pew of a small Methodist church in a suit too tight across the shoulders and had not said a word to anyone, except to lean over the open casket at the end and whisper something that Marcus had never asked him to repeat. Marcus had gone on to the Marine Corps himself, Desert Storm, 2 tours, came home, earned his MBA at night, built a career in regional banking, rose through the ranks, and 4 years ago, at the age of 49, he had become the chief executive officer of the parent company that a year later would acquire Hartwell Savings and Trust. The very first thing he had done after the acquisition closed was pull up the customer list of the Hartwell branch and type his father's Marine's name into the search bar. Earl Whittaker, Hartwell, North Carolina. Account opened March of 1972. Marcus had flagged the account that same night. And on the afternoon of November 10th, Marine Corps birthday, as his driver Anthony pulled the black SUV out of the underground garage of the Charlotte headquarters and merged onto Interstate 85 northbound, Marcus Holloway sat in the back seat, unzipped the garment bag he kept in his office for Marine Corps birthday ball evenings, and began, without hurry and without hesitation, to change into his dress blues. Inside the Hartwell branch, Tyler Brennan was doing what men like Tyler Brennan do when they have begun to suspect that something is wrong, but cannot yet allow themselves to admit it. He was doubling down. He had walked over to the cluster of chairs where Earl sat and had asked him, again, where the money was going. Earl had told him, again quietly, that it was for his granddaughter's wedding. Tyler had asked for the granddaughter's phone number so he could, in his own words, verify the claim. Earl had looked up at him and had said in a voice that was a shade quieter than before, "Son, my granddaughter is at a final dress fitting with her mother. I am not going to interrupt her dress fitting a week before her wedding because you don't believe me." Tyler had smiled the tight, practiced smile of a man who is losing his composure in small increments and trying not to show it. "Sir, I understand you're frustrated, but there are protocols we have to follow to protect elderly customers from exploitation. If you cooperate with us, we can resolve this quickly." Earl had nodded. He had not argued. He had not raised his voice. But for the first time that afternoon, something in his face had shifted. A small tightening at the corner of his jaw, a small cold light in the pale blue eyes, and Ray Donovan, standing 4 feet to his left with his hand resting on his duty belt, had seen it and had felt his stomach turn over slowly. Because he had seen that exact expression in the eyes of a staff sergeant outside Fallujah the night before a raid in 2005, and he knew precisely what it meant. It meant that the man in the padded chair was not disoriented. It meant that the man in the padded chair was, by a very wide margin, the most dangerous and most patient person in the room, and had been from the moment he had walked through the front door. Ray took a single step back. Sarah Mitchell, who was still standing in line and had not been able to make herself walk out, watched Tyler turn and cross the lobby toward his office, and she pulled out her phone and began very quietly to record. What happened over the next 11 minutes would be the 12-minute video that 3 days later would have 14 million views and would cost Tyler Brennan not just his job in banking, but his career in financial services of any kind. But at that precise moment, as Tyler disappeared into his office, and as Earl folded his hands a little tighter in his lap, and as Margaret Porter came back out of the break room with red-rimmed eyes, not a single person in that lobby, not Sarah, not Margaret, not Ray, not Tyler himself, heard the sound of the black SUV turning at last into the parking lot outside. The black SUV parked in the visitor's space nearest the front door. The driver, a quiet man named Anthony who had worked for Marcus Holloway for 6 years, stepped out first and opened the rear passenger door. The man who stepped out after him was 53 years old, 6 feet even, with close-cropped greying hair and the kind of posture that does not come from a yoga studio. He was wearing a charcoal suit jacket over the deep blue of a Marine Corps dress blouse. The red blood stripe of the trousers was visible down the seam of each leg. On his left chest was a small rectangle of ribbons that included at the top a purple circle with a gold profile, and just beneath it a narrow ribbon of alternating red, white, and blue that very few people in that parking lot would have been able to identify by sight. And that meant, in the shorthand of men who knew, that the man wearing it had done something at some point in his life that his country had quietly decided it would never forget. He did not stop to button his jacket. He walked directly to the glass doors of the branch and he pushed them open and he walked into the lobby, and every single person inside turned their head to look at him. Tyler Brennan, who was halfway back from his office to the teller counter with a sheaf of paperwork in his hand, froze. Margaret Porter, who had just stepped back behind her window, put her hand over her mouth. Ray Donovan, standing 5 feet from Earl's chair, saw the blouse under the suit jacket and the ribbons on the chest, and without thinking about it, without deciding to, he came to attention. Marcus Holloway did not look at any of them. He was looking, and had been looking since the instant he crossed the threshold, at the old man in the padded chair by the window. He crossed the lobby in 7 slow, unhurried steps. He stopped 6 feet from Earl's chair, and in a voice that was not loud but was absolutely clear, a voice that reached every corner of that small branch and the ears of every person in it, Marcus Holloway said, "Staff Sergeant Whitaker, I am sorry I am late, sir." Earl Whitaker looked up. He looked at the man standing in front of him. He looked at the uniform under the jacket and at the ribbons and at the face and at the eyes, which were the same pale, sun-creased eyes his father had had. And for the first time in a great many years, Earl Whitaker's voice failed him. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked down at his hands in his lap, and then, when he lifted his head again, there was water in the corners of his eyes that had not been there a minute before. Marcus Holloway did not wait for Earl to speak. He did not expect him to. He turned his body very slowly to face the lobby. He looked first at Margaret Porter, who was still frozen with her hand over her mouth. He looked at Ray Donovan, still standing at attention 4 feet from Earl's chair. He looked at Sarah Mitchell, who was still, quietly and steadily, recording. And then he looked at Tyler Brennan, who was standing in the middle of the lobby like a man who had walked into a room and forgotten why he had come in. "I'd like to introduce all of you," Marcus said, in the measured cadence of a man who had given a great many speeches in his life but who had been rehearsing this one silently, for longer than anyone in that room could have imagined. "To Staff Sergeant Earl Whitaker, United States Marine Corps, retired, 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines. He served 2 tours in Vietnam. On the morning of March 22nd, 1969, in the An Hoa Valley, he carried my father, 1st Lieutenant James Holloway, almost 2 miles under sustained enemy fire with 3 gunshot wounds in his own body. He was awarded the Silver Star for what he did that morning. I have the citation framed above my desk in Charlotte. He has been a customer of this bank since the spring of 1972, when he came home from that war with $187 in discharge pay and a promise to himself that he was going to build a life worth having in the country he had bled for. He has, by every single measure I know how to measure a man, done exactly that." Marcus paused. He looked back at Earl, who was sitting very still in the padded chair with his hands in his lap, and then, with a precision that came from 30 years of practice in 2 different uniforms, Marcus Holloway squared his shoulders, brought his heels together, raised his right hand sharply to the corner of his brow, and rendered Earl Whitaker the slowest and sharpest salute that any civilian in that building had ever seen in their lives. "Staff Sergeant," he said, and his voice broke for the first and only time that afternoon, "on behalf of my father and my family and the country you carried him home to, thank you, sir. Thank you." Earl Whitaker, 81 years old, did what any Marine of his generation does when another Marine offers him a salute. He put his hands on the arms of the chair and he pushed himself up onto his feet. His knees shook, his left hand trembled at his side, and he returned Marcus Holloway's salute with a hand that, for just one single moment, did not shake at all. In the silence that followed, the only sound in that bank was the quiet, unmistakable sound of Margaret Porter, behind the counter, beginning to cry. And in that silence, Marcus Holloway turned his head, very slowly, to look at the man who was still standing in the middle of the lobby with his mouth slightly open and his face the colour of bleached paper. What Marcus Holloway was about to say to Tyler Brennan was not something Tyler would remember, word for the rest of his life. It was something he would remember every single syllable of. Marcus Holloway lowered his salute. He looked at Earl, and he smiled a small, private smile, and he said, "Sir, please, sit down. I need to handle one more thing." Earl lowered himself back into the padded chair without protest. Marcus turned. He walked, unhurried, across the lobby, and he stopped directly in front of Tyler Brennan. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture. He put his hands, instead, into the pockets of his dress blue trousers, in a way that Tyler would later realize was itself a kind of answer. "Mr. Brennan," Marcus said. "Is that right?" Tyler nodded. His mouth worked. No sound came out. "Mr. Brennan, my name is Marcus Holloway. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the parent company that owns this branch, and every other branch of Hartwell Savings and Trust in 3 states. I have been the CEO of this company for 4 years. I have been in banking for 21. In those 21 years, Mr. Brennan, I have made a great many mistakes. I have misread customers. I have misread employees. I have misread markets. But I have never, in my entire career, not once, publicly humiliated a decorated combat veteran in the lobby of one of my own branches because I was trying to hit a quarterly fraud flag target." Tyler's face had gone from white to a strange mottled red. Marcus kept his voice low and even and almost kind. "I read your branch performance report this morning on the drive up here. I read the email my regional vice president sent you on Friday. I understand the pressure you are under, Mr. Brennan. I understand you're 29 years old and you're afraid of losing your job, and your fiancé is asking you when you are going to make real money. I want you to know that I understand every part of that." He paused for exactly one breath. "And I want you to also know that in about 2 minutes, I am going to walk out of this branch with Staff Sergeant Whitaker, and I'm going to personally drive him to our flagship branch in Charlotte, where my regional vice president is going to apologize to him in person, and we are going to process his withdrawal in full, and we are going to upgrade his account, at no charge to him, to the highest tier of private banking services this company offers, for as long as he wishes to remain a customer. And then, Mr. Brennan," and here Marcus's voice dropped by a single careful shade, "I am going to come back to this branch tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp, and you and I are going to have a much longer conversation. Do you understand what I am telling you?" Tyler Brennan nodded very slowly. He did not speak. He could not, because what he had just realized standing in the middle of his own lobby, with 11 customers watching and 1 young woman still recording, was that the old man he had called disoriented and dismissed as a fraud risk had been the single most important person in the room from the moment he had walked through the front door, and that he, Tyler Brennan, had been, for the entirety of that afternoon, exactly the opposite. Marcus Holloway walked back across the lobby. He held out his hand to Earl, and Earl took it, and Marcus helped him up out of the padded chair with the careful, reverent gentleness that a son uses to help an aging father out of a church pew. They walked together slowly toward the front doors. They did not hurry. At the glass doors, Earl paused. He turned around, and he looked for a long quiet moment at Margaret Porter, who was still crying softly behind the counter. He looked at Ray Donovan, who was still standing at attention. He looked at Sarah Mitchell, who had at last lowered her phone, and he looked, finally, for just a few seconds, at Tyler Brennan. He did not glare at Tyler. He did not smile at him either. He simply looked at him the way a man looks at someone he has decided, for reasons of his own, to forgive. And then Earl Whitaker said the only words he would speak in that lobby that afternoon, other than the ones he had said to Margaret about his granddaughter's wedding. He said, in a voice that was quiet but clear, "Son, I hope you sleep well tonight." And then he walked, with Marcus beside him, out the front door. The black SUV pulled away from the curb a minute later, with Earl in the passenger seat and Marcus in the back and Anthony behind the wheel. Margaret Porter watched it go through the front window with her hand still over her mouth. Ray Donovan walked back to his post by the door and did not speak another word for the rest of his shift. Sarah Mitchell sat down slowly in one of the padded chairs that Earl had just left, and she looked at the 12-minute video on the screen of her phone and at the little red upload button she had not yet pressed, and she did not press it right away. She thought about it for a long time, what nobody in that branch knew yet, what none of them would realize until the following morning, when the video would go live and then briefly go nowhere and then, in the space of a single Wednesday afternoon, go absolutely everywhere. was that before Sarah Mitchell posted that video, she was going to do something else first. Something that would turn a local story into a national one, and would make what Earl Whittaker had said about sleeping well tonight a sentence that hundreds of thousands of strangers would repeat to each other before the week was out. Sarah Mitchell, it turned out, was a first-year law student at the State University. She was 25 years old. Her own grandfather had been a Marine. Her grandfather had died 4 years earlier in a VA hospital bed set up in a hallway because there had been no room in the ward. She had not been able to stop thinking about it since. That night, in her small apartment over a coffee shop on Franklin Street, Sarah Mitchell sat at her kitchen table and wrote a 3,000-word essay to accompany the video. The essay was not about the bank. The essay was about what it meant to be invisible in old age, about what it meant to be dismissed because your clothes were worn and your hand trembled and your voice was quiet, about how an entire country could say it loved its veterans on one day in November and then, on every other day of the year, walk past them in waiting rooms without seeing them at all. The essay was about Earl Whittaker, whose full name and unit designation she had gotten from a public record search and a phone call to the Hartwell County Historical Society. It was also, in its final paragraph, about her grandfather, whose name she gave in full and whose last photograph she included. She posted the video and the essay together at 9:14 on Wednesday morning. By Wednesday night, the post had 3 million views. By Friday, it had 14. By the following Sunday, the video had been aired on 3 national news programs, and a sitting United States Senator had entered a short speech about Earl Whittaker into the congressional record. Ellie Whittaker's wedding took place exactly as planned, the following Saturday in a small white clapboard chapel on the outskirts of Hartwell. Earl walked her down the aisle. His left hand trembled on her arm. She did not care at all. At the reception, Marcus Holloway sat at a table in the back in a regular grey suit this time, and he watched Earl dance with his granddaughter to an old Patsy Cline song that Ruth had loved, and he cried quietly the way his father had cried in a Camp Lejeune parking lot 43 years earlier. Tyler Brennan did not lose his job immediately. Marcus had the longer conversation with him on Tuesday morning as promised. Tyler kept his position for 6 more months, during which time he was required to complete a very different sort of training program, one that Marcus designed personally and that involved, among other things, 40 hours of volunteer work at a local Veterans Affairs outreach centre. At the end of those 6 months, Tyler Brennan resigned from banking. He took a job, of all things, as a full-time case manager at that same VA outreach centre. He took a significant pay cut. His fiancée, who did not understand and did not wish to, left him in the spring. And a year after that, Tyler Brennan stood up at a small regional dinner in honour of a Volunteer of the Year award, and he told the story of an old man in a bank lobby, and he wept openly at the podium in front of 200 strangers, and he said, at the end, that the worst day of his life had been the day that saved it. Earl Whittaker lived another 4 years. He walked his granddaughter down the aisle. He held his first great-grandchild, a small red-faced boy named James, after a man Earl had once carried home. He died in his sleep, in the back bedroom of the small white house on the edge of Hartwell County, with his wife Ruth's wedding ring closed inside his right hand and a framed photograph of a very young Marine lieutenant from Wilmington, North Carolina, standing watch on the nightstand beside him. Marcus Holloway gave the eulogy at the funeral. He wore his dress blues. He told the story of a morning in Anhoa Valley, and the story of an afternoon in a bank lobby, and the story of a man who had not raised his voice in anger since the summer of 1970 and had never once needed to. The thing about honour, Marcus said at that funeral, is that it does not announce itself. It does not ask for recognition. It does not insist on being seen. It simply waits. It waits patiently, in a padded chair by a window with folded hands and pale blue eyes, for the world to remember what it was supposed to have known all along. If this story moved you, if you believe the Earl Whittakers of this world deserve to be seen and thanked and saluted before they are gone from us, subscribe to this channel. We tell these stories because they are true, and because they matter, and because in every small town in this country, there are men and women sitting quietly in waiting rooms at this very moment, carrying histories that no one around them can possibly imagine. Share this video. Tell someone about Staff Sergeant Earl Whittaker, and the next time you walk into a bank or a diner or a waiting room, and you see an old man with a tremor in his hand and a worn jacket and tired eyes, take a second look. You might be standing next to the man who carried somebody home,